The morning I brought him home, it was raining. Not a heavy storm, just that quiet, gray kind of rain that makes everything feel slower. I remember standing at the door with him wrapped in a blanket, half expecting him to bolt the moment I set him down. That's what everything inside me was braced for. The panic, the scratching, the wild, desperate need to find a way out. But he didn't do any of that. He looked up at me, those deep brown eyes steady, almost calm, and then he walked into my living room like he owned it. No hesitation, no circling. He crossed the floor, climbed up onto the couch, and sat down right beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off him. I didn't move for a long moment, because something about the way he settled in, the way he just sat there, like he'd been waiting to find this spot his whole life, felt like it meant something I wasn't ready to name yet. His name was Coco, and he was a western lowland gorilla, maybe 18 months old, small for his age. His hands were already enormous, though thick-fingered and gentle in the same breath. He smelled like rain and something earthy, like forest floor after a long night. The rescue organization had called me 3 days earlier. They said he'd been found alone. They didn't say much else, and I didn't push. There are some histories that reveal themselves slowly, and I've learned to wait. What I wasn't prepared for, what no one warned me about, was how quickly he would reach for me. Not figuratively, literally. Within the first hour, while I was sitting beside him trying to give him space, he turned, lifted one heavy hand, and pressed his palm flat against my cheek, slowly, the way you might touch something unfamiliar, not with fear, but with a kind of wondering attention. I held completely still. His fingers were warm. He tilted his head slightly to one side, studying my face the way a child studies a word they've never heard before, trying to work out its meaning. I didn't know what to do except stay very quiet and let him. That was the beginning. By afternoon, something had shifted that I couldn't quite explain. He had started watching me, not the anxious watching of a cornered animal, but focused, deliberate attention. When I stood up, he stood up. When I walked to the kitchen, he followed, not rushing, just staying close. When I sat down at the table with a cup of coffee, he climbed into the chair across from me and sat upright, spine straight, hands folded in his lap, looking at me like we were about to have a conversation. I laughed. I couldn't help it. But the laughter faded a little when I realized he wasn't being funny. He was being serious. He picked up a mug from the table, sniffed it, then held it the way I was holding mine, 2 hands, carefully, like he understood that this was what you did here, like he was already trying to figure out the rules of this place, of this life. I set down my cup and just watched him, and something quiet and heavy settled in my chest that I wouldn't fully understand for months. He had been rescued from a situation I still don't know the full details of. What I was told was that he had been alone for some time before they found him. How long, they weren't certain. What had happened to his mother, they didn't say. But you don't need words to understand loss. Not when you've sat across from it at a kitchen table and watched it hold a coffee mug with both hands just to feel like it belongs somewhere. He wasn't a wild animal trying to survive in a strange place. He was something else entirely, something that made my chest ache in a way I wasn't ready for. That evening, he discovered the television. He sat on the floor about 2 feet from the screen, completely still, watching a nature documentary of all things with the focused concentration of someone trying to memorize every detail. When a bird flew across the screen, his eyes tracked it. When something moved fast, he leaned forward slightly. I sat behind him on the couch, and every few minutes he would turn and look at me, then look back at the screen, like he was checking, "Are you seeing this too?" I was seeing it. I was seeing all of it. But there were other moments that first day that stayed with me longer than the funny ones. Moments when he would go very still, in the middle of playing or eating or watching me move around the room, and just stare. Not at me, not at anything in particular, just out, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear, or remembering something I couldn't see. Those moments never lasted long. Something would pull his attention back, a sound, a movement, and he'd be present again, curious again. But they happened, and each time I felt the weight of whatever he was carrying, even though he had no way to tell me what it was. By the time night came, he had followed me from room to room for hours. He'd sat with me while I read. He'd watched me wash dishes with the same careful attention he gave everything. He'd pressed his forehead against the window for a long time, looking out at the dark and the rain, and I had stood beside him and looked out too, and neither of us said anything because there was nothing to say. When I finally turned off the lamp and settled onto the couch, he climbed up beside me, not at the far end, right beside me, close, and then he went still. And then he started shaking, not violently, just a low, steady trembling. His hands gripped the edge of my sleeve. His eyes were open, fixed on the dark in the corner of the room. He wasn't looking at anything. He was braced against something, something internal, something old. I put my hand over his. He didn't let go. and I lay there in the quiet, listening to the rain against the window, wondering what it was that a creature this young could already be so afraid of losing. The weeks that followed were some of the strangest and most quietly beautiful of my life. Coco settled into the rhythms of the house, the way water finds its level, not by force but by nature. He learned where things were. He learned what sounds meant what. The coffee grinder in the morning meant I was waking up, and he would appear in the kitchen doorway within minutes, knuckles on the tile, watching me with those steady eyes like a coworker who'd already been there an hour. The sound of my keys meant I was leaving, and that always produced a different reaction entirely. A low sound in his throat, not quite distress, but close enough that I started leaving and returning several times a day in short increments, just so he could learn that leaving wasn't permanent. He was a fast learner, faster than I had any right to expect. Within the first 2 weeks, he had figured out the light switches. Not perfectly. He'd slapped the whole plate with his palm, and seemed genuinely surprised when the room went dark, but the understanding was there. Cause and effect, action and outcome. He'd turn the light off, look at the room, then turn it back on and look at me like he wanted to discuss what had just happened. I'd nod seriously, the way you do when a child shows you something they're proud of, and he'd turn the light off again, satisfied. He started sitting at the table for meals, not beside me on the floor, not across the room, at the table, upright in the chair, watching me with careful attention while I set out food for him. He had preferences. He loved mango, passionately and without apology. He was suspicious of anything green. He would pick up a piece of food, sniff it slowly, then look at me as if asking for a second opinion. If I nodded, he'd try it. If I didn't react fast enough, he'd set it down and push it to the edge of his bowl with one finger. A final verdict. There was so much laughter in those weeks. He watched television every evening, always in the same spot on the floor, always leaning slightly forward. He reacted to things, not the way a startled animal reacts to sudden movement, but the way a person reacts to something unexpected. A sharp intake of breath, a tilt of the head. Once during a scene with loud arguing, he got up from his spot, walked to my end of the couch, and climbed up beside me without explanation, just moved closer. Like the noise had unsettled something, and proximity was the solution. I understood that completely. He mimicked emotions the way he mimicked everything else, by watching first and then trying. When I laughed, there was something in his expression that shifted, loosened. When I was tired, moving slowly through the house in the early mornings, he moved slowly too. When I was focused on something at the desk, he would find something nearby to focus on as well. A book, an object, anything, and sit with the same quiet concentration, as if keeping me company in that particular mode of being. It stopped feeling like observation. It started feeling like fluency, and that was exactly when things began to trouble me. I noticed it gradually, the way you notice a change in weather, not all at once but in small shifts that accumulate until one morning you look up and realize the sky is a completely different color than it was a month ago. The first thing I noticed was how he moved, or more precisely, how he had stopped moving the way he should. Young gorillas are physical in ways that are almost restless, climbing, pushing, testing weight and height and distance with their bodies. Coco had been like that in the first days. But somewhere in the weeks of living rooms and light switches and dinner tables, that restlessness had gone quiet. He still moved, still played, but it was smaller, more contained, more human. He had stopped knuckle walking almost entirely. He walked upright now most of the time, unhurried, with his hands loosely at his sides. It was charming, genuinely watching this small figure cross the kitchen on 2 feet, swaying slightly, heading toward the fruit bowl with great purpose. But underneath the charm was something I couldn't ignore for long, something that felt less like progress and more like loss. He wasn't becoming more himself. He was becoming more like me. The wildlife specialist's name was Dr. Reyes. She came on a Thursday in the late afternoon, and she watched Coco for a long time before she said anything. Coco, for his part, watched her back with open curiosity, then looked at me, then back at her, clearly placing her in the category of someone my person has invited, therefore probably fine. He brought her a piece of mango. She accepted it solemnly. I think he liked her after that. But what she told me afterward, standing in the hallway while Coco sat at the table behind us eating his share of the mango with studied dignity, was not easy to hear. She said it gently, the way people say things they know will land hard. She said that the bonding she was observing, the depth of it, the completeness of it, was not something she saw often, and not something to take lightly. That a gorilla at this stage of development was building the internal architecture of who he would be for the rest of his life, what he bonded to, what he recognized as home, what he understood as his own kind. She said that Coco was, right now, in the process of deciding all of those things, and he was deciding them based entirely on me. She didn't say it was my fault. She didn't need to. I stood in my own hallway and felt the full weight of what she was describing settle into me slowly, like cold water rising. Every warm moment I had treasured, every laugh, every mirrored expression, every time he had reached for my hand in the dark, all of it was still real, all of it still mattered. But underneath the warmth was something I hadn't let myself look at directly, that I had become for this animal, the entire world, his reference point for safety, his model for behavior, his definition of belonging. And I was the wrong world for him. That didn't make it stop hurting. The signs that Dr. Reyes pointed out were harder to unsee once I knew what I was looking for. Outside, where other animals moved with ease, Coco became uncertain. He would follow me into the yard but stay close, always within arm's reach, scanning the open space with something between discomfort and mild alarm. He didn't climb. There was a large oak at the edge of the property, solid, with low branches perfectly sized for a young gorilla to start learning on, and he would sometimes stand at the base of it, look up and then look back at me, as if waiting for instruction, as if the tree required my approval before it was safe to touch. I started standing near the tree, encouraging him quietly. He would put one hand on the bark, feel the texture, and then step back. A gorilla, uncertain of a tree. That image stayed with me for a long time. He still clung to me at night, still pressed close in the dark, but now when I felt his weight against me, there was something mixed into the tenderness that hadn't been there before, a low persistent ache, because I understood something I hadn't been willing to understand before. He wasn't holding on because he was home. He was holding on because he was afraid that without me there was nothing. And I had to decide what love actually meant when the most loving thing I could do was also the hardest thing I had ever imagined doing. The rehabilitation center was 3 hours away. I had driven past it once, years before, without knowing what it was. Dr. Reyes mentioned it the way doctors mention difficult options, carefully, giving you time to sit with the word before you have to respond to it. She said they were good people. She said they had done this before, successfully. She said successfully, and I heard it as both a comfort and a verdict. Coco came and found me that night. He climbed onto the couch, pressed himself against my side, and fell asleep with his hand wrapped around 2 of my fingers. I didn't sleep at all. The morning I had decided on came the way mornings do when you've been dreading them too quickly, and with a kind of ordinary cruelty. The sun came through the kitchen window the same way it always did. The coffee grinder made the same sound, and Coco appeared in the doorway the same way he had every morning for months, knuckles on the tile, eyes finding me first before anything else in the room. I stood at the counter and looked at him and tried to memorize it, the way he tilted his head when he was deciding something, the particular way he moved when he was happy, a looseness in his shoulders, a kind of rolling ease in his step. I had learned to read him the way you learn to read someone you love, through repetition and attention, until their smallest movements carry full sentences. I knew when he was tired. I knew when he was uncertain. I knew the exact sound he made when something delighted him, and the exact stillness that came over him when something was wrong. He knew me too. That was the part I hadn't let myself think about too directly until now. He had spent these months learning me just as carefully as I had been learning him. My moods, my routines, the specific weight of my silences. He knew the difference between the quiet of me reading and the quiet of me worrying. And that morning from the doorway he watched me standing at the counter not moving and not drinking my coffee, and he knew. I don't know what it looked like from his side. I don't know what signal he read, what shifted in my posture or my face or the air between us, but something reached him, because instead of crossing the kitchen to his chair the way he always did, he stayed in the doorway, watching me. And that low sound came into his throat, not distress, not yet, but close, the sound of something not quite right. I went to him. I crouched down in front of him and he put both hands on my face immediately, the way he had that very first day, and he studied me with those deep, steady eyes, looking for an answer I didn't know how to give him. I stayed very still and let him look, and I kept my face as calm as I could, and I told him quietly, out loud, even though I knew the words meant nothing to him, that this wasn't because I didn't love him, that it was because I did. He dropped his hands eventually, and leaned his forehead against mine. We stayed like that for a long moment. The transport team arrived mid-morning. 2 people from the rehabilitation center, both quiet and experienced in the way that people are when they have done something difficult many times, and learned to do it gently. They moved slowly through the house. They didn't rush anything. They had brought a familiar-smelling blanket, a technique Dr. Reyes had suggested, something that carried a neutral scent, nothing alarming. They set it on the couch and left it there and let Coco investigate it on his own terms. He sniffed it, looked at me, sniffed it again. He wasn't afraid of them. That was one small mercy. He was curious the way he was curious about most things, openly, carefully, watching them move and cataloging what he observed. One of them sat on the floor near the couch and simply waited, not reaching, not coaxing, just present. Coco watched her for several minutes from across the room, then moved a few steps closer. Then a few more, but he kept coming back to me. Every few minutes he would return, touch my hand, press against my leg, look up at my face, and then move toward them again, like he was checking, like he needed to confirm each time that I was still there before he could afford to be curious about anything else. Each time he came back, I kept my hands steady, and my voice low, and I didn't pull him close, even though everything in me wanted to, because I had promised myself I wouldn't make this harder by making it about what I needed. The actual moment of leaving came slowly, and then all at once. He was near the transport carrier, not inside it, just near it, sniffing the edge, when he seemed to realize that something had shifted in the room. Maybe the way the two people had moved, maybe some change in my stillness. He turned and looked at me from across the room, and for a second neither of us moved. Then he came to me fast, not panicked but fast and deliberate. He pressed himself against my legs and wrapped both arms around my knees, and held on with a strength that surprised me even now. His face was turned upward, looking at me, and the expression, I have tried many times since to find the right word for it, and I keep failing, because human words weren't built for what I saw. It wasn't rage, or fear or grief exactly. It was something more like confusion at the edge of understanding, like he was trying to ask a question and couldn't find the form for it. I reached down and held him. I held him for a long time, long enough that the two transport workers looked at each other and then looked away, long enough that the sound outside, a bird, a passing car, the ordinary world continuing, felt very far away. I held him and I felt his hands gripping the back of my shirt, and I let myself feel the full weight of it because I thought he deserved that much, that I not look away from it. Then I loosened my hold. He tightened his. I loosened again, gently, the way you do with a child who doesn't want to wake up from something good, and slowly, not without resistance, not without that low sound in his throat rising slightly, he let the distance open between us. One of the transport workers was beside him now, calm and unhurried, a hand resting near him without pressing. He looked at her. He looked back at me. I nodded. I don't know why I nodded. He didn't understand the gesture, but it was all I had. He was guided to the carrier slowly, with patience, with no force involved at any point. He went in the way he did most things, observing, cautious, ultimately willing. But just before the door was latched, he turned. He looked at me through the grate, not with panic, not crying out, just looking. Those enormous steady eyes fixed on my face with that full, unguarded attention that had undone me the first day, and was undoing me again now. And I stood in the middle of my own living room with the morning light coming through the same windows it always came through, and I looked back at him and I did not look away. The carrier was lifted, the front door opened, and then they were outside, and then they were at the vehicle, and then there was the soft sound of doors closing and an engine turning over, and I stood in the doorway and watched until the vehicle turned at the end of the street and was gone. The house was very quiet. It had been quiet before he came. I had been used to that quiet, had lived in it comfortably for years. But this was a different kind. This was the shape of something removed. The chair at the table, the low spot on the couch, the light switch, smudged at the edges from small wide palms. I sat down on the floor in the middle of the living room. I'm not sure why the floor exactly, but it felt right, and I sat there in the quiet for a long time, not falling apart, not performing composure either, just sitting with it. The way you sit with things that are true and painful and right, all at the same time, which is the hardest kind of sitting there is. The first update came 11 days later. A short email from the rehabilitation center. A few sentences and 2 photographs attached. I opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where he had once sat across from me with a coffee mug held in both hands, studying me with those patient, wondering eyes. I opened it and read it twice before I looked at the photographs. The first one was taken from a distance. He was standing at the edge of a wide outdoor enclosure, one hand resting on a low branch, not climbing, just touching it. His back was to the camera, and you couldn't see his face, but something in his posture was different from what I had known, less contained, like something was beginning to loosen in him that had been held tight for a long time. The second photograph was closer. He was looking at something off to the left of the frame, and whoever had taken the picture had caught him in a moment of stillness. That particular quality of attention he had, that focused, wondering look, I knew so well, but the setting around him was all open air and green space, and the kind of light that only comes from being outside, really outside, not a yard, not a window. I sat with those 2 photographs for a long time. The days after he left had been strange in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't been through something like it. Not devastating, exactly. Or not only that, more like the particular disorientation of a changed routine, when your body still expects something that is no longer there. I caught myself listening for him in the mornings, the sound of him in the kitchen doorway, the particular rhythm of his movement through the house. Twice in the first week I turned to say something to him and found only the empty room, and both times I stood there for a moment with the sentence unfinished and then let it go. I cleaned the house slowly, over several days, not erasing, just restoring. The smudged light switch I left for a while before finally wiping it clean, and even then I stood there afterward with the cloth in my hand feeling like I had done something I wasn't sure about. But the updates kept coming, and each one carried something I hadn't fully allowed myself to hope for. 3 weeks in, the staff reported that he had begun exploring the enclosure more widely, moving away from the areas near the caregivers and into the open space. Still cautious, still observing before committing. That was simply his nature, and I suspected it always would be, but moving, covering ground. By the 4th week he had climbed, not high, not for long, but he had gone up into the branches of one of the trees in the enclosure and sat there for nearly 20 minutes, and the caregiver who wrote to me said she had watched him, and he had looked, in her words, completely absorbed. I read that word absorbed and felt something shift in my chest. Not grief this time, something quieter, something that took me a moment to identify because I hadn't felt it in a while. Relief. The real turning point came in the 6th week. There were 2 other young gorillas at the center, both in various stages of their own rehabilitation, and the staff had been managing the introductions carefully, short supervised encounters, watching for stress signals, giving everyone time. Coco, predictably, had approached these meetings the way he approached everything new, with long patient observation followed by cautious, deliberate engagement. No rushing, just that steady, careful attention, and then when he had decided, a kind of quiet willingness. By the 6th week he was spending several hours a day with the others. By the 8th week he was sleeping near them. I received a video that week, 30 seconds, shot on a phone, slightly shaky. Coco and one of the other young gorillas, a female about his size, were sitting together in the afternoon light, close enough to touch. She was grooming his arm with the focused, unhurried attention that gorillas give to that particular act, and he was sitting very still, letting her. His eyes were half closed, his shoulders were completely relaxed. That specific looseness I had learned to associate with his happiness, the ease in him when something felt right, was there unmistakably in every line of him. I watched the video 4 times, then I closed my phone and sat quietly for a while, because some things need a moment of stillness to be properly received. The visit was arranged for the 10th week. The staff felt enough time had passed, enough new ground had been covered, enough new rhythms established, that a visit from me would be recognizable to him without being destabilizing. I drove the 3 hours on a clear morning in early autumn, the kind of morning where the light is thin and golden and everything looks considered. I hadn't seen him in over 2 months. I had no idea what to expect. What I found was not what I left. He was in the open enclosure when I arrived, moving through the space with an ease that stopped me at the fence, not the careful, checking movement of his house days. This was something more settled, more instinctive. He was covering ground the way ground is meant to be covered, with his body low and his weight distributed, and his attention moving freely between the environment and the other gorillas nearby. He looked, in the plainest possible terms, like himself, like whatever version of himself had been waiting underneath everything else. One of the staff stood beside me, and we watched him for a few minutes without calling out. Then she made a small sound, a greeting sound he recognized from the center, and he looked up. He found her first, then he found me. The moment he did, he went still. That same complete stillness, that same quality of total attention, focused and direct and entirely without distraction. He looked at me from across the enclosure with those deep, familiar eyes, and I looked back at him, and neither of us moved for what felt like a long time. Then he came toward me, not running, not the urgent, clinging approach I had known in those last weeks at home, just walking, steadily, with that upright, rolling ease that was uniquely his. He came to the fence and stopped an arm's length away, and looked at me. His face was the same, older maybe, something in it had settled, but the same wondering attention, the same quality of presence that had reached me the very first day. I put my hand against the fence. He looked at it. Then he reached out and pressed his palm flat against mine through the wire, and held it there, warm, steady. We stood like that for a while, and then, and this was the thing I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count, he stepped back. Not away from me, not with any sense of withdrawal or loss, just back, into his space, into the open air and the afternoon light and the world that was, without question, his. He glanced at me once more, that considering look, and then his attention shifted naturally to the other gorillas nearby, and he moved toward them with the ease of someone returning to a conversation they'd stepped away from for a moment. He didn't look back again, and I stood at the fence and watched him go and felt, running through the grief and the love and the ache of all those months, something I hadn't expected to feel as strongly as I did. Pride. Not the pride of ownership, not the pride of having made him into something. The other kind, the harder, cleaner kind. The pride of watching something find its own shape, its own ground, its own belonging, and knowing that the best thing you ever did was get out of the way of that. I drove home in the long autumn light with the windows down and the radio off, and I thought about all the ways we hold on to things we love, how natural it is, how human, how sometimes completely wrong. I thought about the couch and the coffee mug and the smudged light switch. I thought about a small figure standing at the base of an oak tree, looking up, waiting for permission to climb, and I thought about what it means to love something enough to give it back to itself. He didn't forget me. I know that now with a certainty I can't fully explain but don't need to. What lives between two creatures who have held on to each other in the dark doesn't simply disappear. It changes form. It becomes something quieter and more permanent than clinging, something that doesn't need proximity to remain true. He found himself again, and in letting him go I think I found something too. Not wisdom exactly. Not a lesson I could write down cleanly and hand to someone else, more like a rearrangement of something inside, a shift in what I understood love to be capable of, and what I understood it to require. Sometimes the deepest love isn't the love that holds on, it's the love that opens its hands, and trusts.